Friends, we are beginning. Okay, good morning. Hello. Okay, so we're going to start our next session, and it's called Acoustic Justice in Brazil and India, continuing with the theme that Kevin planted for us yesterday, pedagogies of listening, and what that can do for us as we continue thinking about social life and creative life practices. So now it is my pleasure to introduce Sérgio Infante, who is a PhD student in global history, focusing on the relationship between the social sciences and anti-poverty programs in 20th century South America. He received a BA in history from Yale College in 2018 and an MPhil in modern South Asian studies from the University of Cambridge in 2019.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Great. So as you can see, the title of this presentation is Hearing Right, Hearing Wrong, Diplomacy, Development, and Brazil-India Relations. I'm afraid I don't have a single musical bone in my body, but I really wanted to play with the auditory theme, so this is my best shot. What I can offer here are my reflections on diplomacy and development as these enormous games of telephone stringing together Brazil and India in the immediate post-independence period. I'll offer some insights on the question of mediators, that is, who or what acts as the telephone conveying messages between one country and the next. I'll also build on a large body of research in the humanities that has noted that European countries often act as go-betweens among what was once called the global south, the third world. More specifically, I explore in this presentation.
Sergio, will you ask if they can get Daniel to mute?
Yeah. Are you able to mute whoever's on Zoom?
Asia will help. It's helping him. Asia is good.
He's there, okay.
He's in the hall.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay,
there we go.
okay,
Good.
yay.
Great. Thank you, Daniel.
So more specifically, I explore in this presentation the differences between British, Portuguese, and Polish mediation. I open with my undergraduate and master's research on Brazilian embassies in South Asia, and then I turn to something more closely aligned with my current research on the history of development economics. So this is the first part of the presentation. It's research carried out between 2018 and 2019, and it's a very particular flavor of history. It's a mix of international and diplomatic history with a heavy dose of cultural and post-colonial studies. So we'll be looking at pictures of the Brazilian embassy in New Delhi and of its diplomatic staff. I hope to demonstrate how the diplomatic relationship between Brazil and India at mid-century was mediated by the participation of two European powers, Britain and Portugal. On October 15th, 1948, the Brazilian government raised the country's diplomatic mission in India to ambassadorial rank. This made Brazil the first Latin American country to have an embassy in South Asia. The Brazilian Foreign Ministry purchased a spacious bungalow, pictured here, on 8 Aurangzeb Road to mark this occasion. Between 1948 and 1950, Brazilian diplomats in New Delhi spent much time building themselves a home on the subcontinent. Their activities included, but were not limited to, the purchase of firewood, electric lights, air conditioners, typewriters, and of course, coffee. Brazilian officials were also tasked with the payment of telephone bills and invoices for pool filtration services. They spent much time hiring office peons and janitorial staffers. So in the image, we see a number of classical European elements. We see a Greek temple facade, columns, and at the very top, a triangular pediment, but we also see a jolly window, which is typical of Mughal architecture in India. Officials in New Delhi received various shipments of luxury goods from London and Paris. The Brazilians also imported a number of typically Brazilian items from the motherland, such as the crest, the Brasilianas, of the Fourth Republic, and a picture of a stadium in Rio de Janeiro, perhaps the Maracanã, the largest arena in the world at the time. Most of the embassy was decorated in a, quote, European manner, with a handful of luso-tropical accents on the walls. So next to the dinner table, for instance, were paintings of Baroque arches and palm trees, familiar scenes in both Brazil and Goa. Goa, of course, only became part of independent India in 1961, so this was right in the middle of the period we're examining. With chintz tapestries and floor cushions, the pavilion room on the right stands in curious contrast to the rest of the embassy's continental decor, although these additions are little more than Orientalist motifs, in my opinion. The diplomats sent to South Asia were European identified men. Several of them could trace their lineages to the British Isles. So Daniel Corbett, for instance, was of Irish and Belgian descent. José Cochrane Jelinka was part Scottish, and Moacir Ribeiro Briggs was of an unspecified British line. Even when these functionaries were none of the above, Portuguese-speaking visitors described them in untranslated English terms, such as gentleman or mister. An example, a wealthy Brazilian visitor to India tells of the following soiree at the embassy. And I quote, "On this occasion, the person in command was Ambassador José Cochrane Jelinka. I did not know him. He had a British posture." You can see it there, he's in the middle. And he wore a beautiful foulard. The man knew how to impress. And one day, after our arrival and before we busied ourselves, he graced us with a dinner ball. It was a total fairy tale, quite a memorable night. End quote. Note those descriptors, a British posture, a foulard. They align these diplomats with Europe and with European culture. But let's forget about them for a moment. Here are the interesting folks. The clerks and secretaries at Brazil's consulates and embassies in South Asia, so this includes Pakistan, were often Goans. Pamela de Abreu in Karachi, José Viegas in Calcutta, Beatriz Correia in New Delhi, just to name a few. The Goan typist was a well-known character in post-war South Asia, better known as Sandra from Bandra. This typist was often a westernized or convent-educated woman, among the first waves of Indian women to enter the white-collar workforce. In diplomatic circles, Goans of either sex were very common. One Brazilian diplomat wrote that the Indian bureaucracy is, and I quote, "full of Silvas, Sousas, and Cicadas. One is hard-pressed to find embassies, legations, or consulates in India without personnel of Portuguese or Portuguesified, aportuguesado descent." Even so, the Brazilian diplomatic corps valued Goans for more specific reasons. As fellow Portuguese speakers, and after Portugal decided to break off diplomatic relations with India in 1954, that's another story, as confidants equipped to handle sensitive correspondence. So what's the takeaway? The Brazilian embassies in Asia were racially and culturally liminal spaces where empires met. Workers had to negotiate punishing hours, low pay, alienation, but also diverging loyalties. One Goan diplomatic worker, for instance, was fired for holding private discussions with critics of the Portuguese Empire. It's easy to conceive of embassies as faceless places carrying out state policy, but they're inhabited by people with different cultural affinities and opinions. And they are the ones who shape state-to-state relations. This solves a bit of a paradox. Brazil was officially anti-colonial at mid-century, but its diplomatic corps was steeped in empire. So this is the second part of the presentation. It relates to my work on the history of development economics. It's somewhat surprising to historians that Latin American and Indian economists rarely interacted during the 1950s and 1960s. Both groups were especially attached to the notion of import substitution industrialization, but they meant slightly different things by this. Latin American economists wanted trade, but on fair terms. Their goal was to develop their country's manufacturing capacity and then to export high-value manufactured goods. In other words, they were advocating protectionism, but only in the short run. Indian economists were much more skeptical of trade. Their country was still locked within the sterling currency area, and trade conducted outside of the sterling area was often carried out in the form of barter. That was most famously the case with the Soviet Union, an empire that also had recurrent foreign currency shortages. As a result, Indian economists did not see trade as a significant source of growth. So one could contrast this to the way that export-led growth had been celebrated in Latin America, even by some of the main proponents of ISI, including Balter. Just because there were few direct conversations does not mean that Brazilian and Indian economists did not influence one another. I'll conclude this presentation with one final character, the Polish-born economist Ignacy Sachs. Polish economists were all over the place at mid-century, in Colombia, Indonesia, and much of sub-Saharan Africa. According to one scholar, economic expertise was, quote, Poland's key export and diplomatic currency in the Third World between 1956 and 1968, end quote. Poland was a special place for two reasons. First, it was European, but decidedly anti-colonial, unlike Britain and Portugal. And second, Poland was socialist, but unlike the USSR, it was nowhere near as orthodox and oppressive about Marxist doctrine. Like many of the pioneers of development economics, Sachs was Jewish. He fled Poland during World War II and lived in Brazil between 1941 and 1954. After the war, Sachs returned to work in Poland, but was quickly dispatched by the government to India. For 3 years, between 1957 and 1960, he worked as a consultant for the Indian government at the Polish embassy. So as an aside, he was a 15-minute drive from the people you met in the first half of this presentation. He also completed his PhD in economics at the Delhi School of Economics at this time. So he was the first European to do so. His dissertation from 1960 and his later work on, quote, eco-development both hinged on comparisons between Brazil and India. Eco-development was the concept that made him famous. It circulated widely, especially in the French-speaking world, and particularly in France, where Sachs had exiled himself after anti-Semitic purges struck Poland in 1968. Eco-development was also a forerunner to what we now call sustainable development. In his biography, The Third Shore, Searching for Eco-Development, Sachs outlined how the two countries, Brazil and India, influenced him. He called India a land of inquiry, a terre de recherche, and he called Brazil a land of inquiry, and he called India a land of inspiration, a terre d'inspiration. Curiously, both Sachs' notion of eco-development and Gilberto Freire's notion of lusotropicalism use environmental metaphors and conditions as the basis for a comparison between Brazil and India. But unlike Freire, who drew somewhat crude equivalencies between one tropical place and another, Sachs was very concerned with the differences between Brazil and India, especially their different approaches to land use. Sachs was also concerned with the treatment of both countries' original inhabitants. In some places, he believed that overprotection of native peoples had led to irrational policies. He lamented that, quote, in Europe, we care more about 300,000 natives in the Amazon than we do about the hundreds of millions of tribal peoples in India, end quote. Make of that opinion what you will. So what can we now say about the different kinds of mediators we encountered? British and Portuguese cultures seem to mediate Brazil-India relations at Brazilian embassies and consulates across South Asia. Polish experts, however, offer us another model of mediation. Socialism and development could serve as languages connecting two places. All three kinds of mediation pass through Europe in one way or another, but mediation by a rich and powerful empire, such as Britain, is very different to mediation by a poor one, such as Portugal. And I hesitate to even broach the question of whether the USSR had an informal empire of its own. I want to end by returning to the question of hearing right and wrong. I've focused in this presentation on the characteristics of mediators rather than on the messages these mediators did or did not convey. I'm wary of scholarship that overemphasizes the virtues of South-South communication, as if the exchange of ideas, just like the exchange of goods, were a virtue in and of itself. Rather than dwell on what was heard right or heard wrong, I prefer to focus on concrete people. And my people are of a very specific kind. They're mediators with special types of expertise, linguistic expertise, as in the case of the Goan typists, or economic expertise, as in the case of the Polish economists. This makes them useful in certain ways, but it also makes them exploitable. And yet, these mediators have an agency and a subjectivity that states cannot fully infringe or usurp. When they participate in international politics, it is as themselves rather than as embodiments of nations. I'll close with a quote by Ignacy Sachs that gives you a sense of his subjectivity and motivations. In his biography, he asks, quote, "Have my attempts to play the role of mediator, jouer le go-between, between Brazil and India, had any effects on the authorities in these countries? Going by their statements, I could say that the answer is yes. Just recently, on his visit to Paris, the Indian Prime Minister Manmohan Singh encouraged me to persist. But I'm dealing with two heavy bureaucracies and our means of action are limited. Furthermore, very few Indians have any knowledge of Brazil, and the converse is just as true. But I'm stubborn. I'm not giving up. I'm still trying." End quote. Take a seat.
Sergio. Now I'd like to introduce Ana-Luiza, who I first met 9 years ago at the very beginning of the project that she's going to be presenting on today, called Memória Rocinha. I met her when she was at the Instituto Moreira Salles, working as the coordinator of social action. And since then, we've been lucky enough to have her join our department as a PhD student. So this is an earlier project that she's going to be presenting, because now she's really working on the Amazon region and visual arts, performance, activism, poetics, and film. And so the project that Ana-Luiza is going to present on today is really just a long project, and she's just going to give us a little piece of it. So
Quando eu fui convidado. É a minha avó que me chamava de Chica da Rocinha, lá no Nordeste da Paraíba.
A senhora vem da Paraíba?
É, eu sou nordestina, eu cheguei...
Pai paraibano também.
É?
Veio com um pezinho.
Eu vim para a Rocinha aos 20 anos de idade, já casada com 2 filhos. A seca nos obrigou, né, a necessidade.
Sorry, just a technological issue. Yes, from the beginning, yes, thank you. This. Well, good morning, everyone. This presentation is about voices. So the sounds and echoes of the alleys and streets, a perspective on the whole histories and of the Rocinha Memory Project. In 2014, I visited Rocinha, a favela in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, for the first time. My destination was the C4 Rocinha Biblioteca Parque, a multi-arts and multimedia space created as part of the Growth Acceleration Federal Program, PAC, in 2012. For 6 months, I worked as a documentary photography teacher, instructing 20 students from journalism, art, and dance on capturing images and curating an art exhibition. I used a motor taxi to reach the library that morning, which stood out as this favela's most affordable, fast, noisy, and abundant transportation. The motor taxi driver took the handlebars and picked me up in front of São Conrado subway station near the commercial area of Rocinha known as Via Ápia. We ascended the hill via the main road known as Estrada da Gávea until we reached C4 Rocinha Biblioteca. During the journey, I established a strong connection with the abundance of sound, from motorcycle engines and advertising vehicles circulating the area. I also immersed myself in the music emanating from local businesses, windows, and gates of some houses. It's a lot. While on the motorcycle, I observed the people moving along the main street, the Estrada da Gávea, and caught partial glimpses of the architecture of houses, businesses, and adjacent streets. Well, we have a problem here. Sorry. Could you help me, please? Sorry. Yeah. And caught partial glimpses of architecture of houses, businesses, and adjacent streets, including staircases, alleys, lanes, and even villages. It was like witnessing an intricate network of, it's because of the internet. Interconnected concrete structures shaped by the sounds and vibrant ways of life that characterize Rocinha. Here. However, I could explore the favela further through the photography classes, walking and documenting it while guiding students in the practical photography exercises. Thus, I visited various areas of Rocinha's territory through the students' photographic perspectives and interests, including alleys, lanes, square schools, cultural centers, and affective street corners. The conversations among residents, the laughter of children on Rocinha's streets, residents listen to the music in their homes, the annoying noise of traffic on the main road, and the echoes reverberating through the narrow, densely populated alleys from a polyphony that integrates with the identity of this favela. Just a second, I think we will need a plan B. I will have like a pen right.
Couldn't you get onto Yale Guest so that you were on the internet? Couldn't you get onto Yale Guest for the internet?
Yeah.
Which might be stable.
But I have a pen drive with plan B.
Yeah,
In case
that
of
might be
the
stable.
technology, yes, it is stable. We can use this. Yes. I guess.
You came prepared.
I know.
Just in the end, I just believe the song. That's okay. Okay, we can skip. Fix there. There we go. Okay. Well, this is one of the landscapes that we have. The best friend of this motor taxi. However, yes, and this experience contributed to find my way of relating to this space to understand its potentialities and vulnerabilities. In the second half of 2014, I remained connected to Rocinha through a partnership between the community and itinerant museum, Museu Sankofa, Memória e História da Rocinha, and the cultural private institution, Instituto Moreira Salles, IMS. In the IMS, I've worked as one of the creators of the Memória Rocinha project and coordinator of the social action area for 9 years. The IMS has branches in Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and Poços de Caldas, boasting an extensive Latin America collections of photographies, iconographies, music, and literature from the 19th century to the 21st centuries, especially Brazilian pieces. The Rio de Janeiro headquarters are located in Gávea, a neighborhood adjacent to Rocinha, approximately 20 minutes away from C4 Rocinha Biblioteca Parque, the residences of Museu Sankofa members. This is one of the lajes. This is the Estrada da Gávea, the famous one. The first moment of Memória Rocinha project was developed between 2014 and 2017 and aimed to investigate the transformations of landscape through historical and current photographs, maps, short documentaries, and oral histories of Rocinha's residents and visitors. It was collaborative in its origin and operated by gathering expectations and needs, navigating through a complex map designed to represent the community in a multifaceted way. The Memória Rocinha platform features photography, video documentary, and maps to document the community history. Over the years, the project was developed in the following stages. 1, project conceptions and development. 2, research in collections and curation of visual material. 3, field work. 4, photographic and audio-visual production. 5, data analysis. 6, programming, graphic design, and conceptual development on the multimedia platform. And finally, 7, launch of the platform. In this presentation, I will focus on stage 4. The project aimed to narrate these stories using images from Rocinha's past and present, but also the memories of its residents. These voices breathe life into their archives and give meaning to Memória Rocinha, contextualizing it within favela's history and inhabitants. The Museu Sankofa and IMS connected to facilitate the formation of an even more complex network and simulate possible challenges, like how to express a reality that it's not our own, how do we represent the museum and realities that are not ours. According to the 2022 census, Rocinha is a favela in Rio de Janeiro that is home to over 67,000 residents. This favela is situated in a city with a population of less than 7 million, which means that Rocinha's population comprises more than 1% of city's total population. It is located in a mountainous geography in one of the Rio de Janeiro most upscale area, surrounded by the neighborhoods of Gávea, São Conrado, and Leblon, and bordering part of the Tijuca forests, like they appointed there. This is the Tijuca forest. And then this is São Conrado, Rocinha, and over there, this is Gávea Rock. Yes. And Brazilian geographer and favela leader Jailson de Souza, in his book O Novo Carioca, 2011, questions the use of the term cidade partida, divided city. From the perspective of favela resident, the author argues that this terminology is widely used by the state and the market to emphasize the city's differences and reinforce inequalities. At the same time, residents of the peripheries themselves see the city as a space of connection. In their lived reality, they must traverse the city daily for work, education, and leisure, and challenging the isolation and fragmentation associated with the term partida, divided. According to his argument, favela residents have a more integrated and active experience of the city because they are forced to do so to survive, contradicting the stigmas of segregation and marginalization. Souza suggests a reflection on the categories still used for research on favelas in Brazil and discusses that it is necessary to consider residents' experiences and perceptions for a more inclusive and comprehensive understanding of favela reality. recognizing their connectivity and active participation in urban life. In addition, the methodology of recording the memory and history of favelas should be considered relevant and part of the creation of these epistemologies as well. Therefore, is it expected that the project has contributed significantly to the public's understanding of the complex process that have shaped the social, environmental, and urban landscape of Rocinha for over a century. To achieve this, Memória Rocinha used memories embedded in photographs, maps, and the voices of Rocinha's residents and visitors as its guiding thread. In its way, it sought to provide an understanding and analyze, allowing the approximation of historical events, social cultural transformations and urban dynamics that shape Rocinha and its residents' experience over time. Through the analysis of historical photos and fieldwork, it was possible to observe how residents' way of life and cultural legacies from migration shaped the architecture and soundscape of the environment, as well as the food and music. These elements make up social memory, which plays a fundamental role in preserving and transmitting a social group's information, knowledge, traditions, values, and experiences over time. It recalls and shares significant elements of a social group's history, contributing to its continuity. Actions related to collective memory are relevant to preventing suppression and reinforcing access to property and fundamental human rights. In Brazil, there is the development of field of knowledge focused on debates around social memory, called social museology. And the leading academic reference is the museologist, poet, and professor of museology, Mário Chagas. He was responsible for creating public policies, debates about decolonizing traditional Brazilian museums, and empowering community museums. Based on this IMS photography archive, the most extensive private collection in Latin America, and the photographic and cartographic archive of Museu Sankofa, the Memória Rocinha. This is one of the archives of Museu Sankofa. This is like the first map of the would be in the future the Rocinha. Okay. Yes, this element, yeah. In the photographic and cartographic archive of Museu Sankofa, the Memória Rocinha team went into the field to connect viewpoints between the past and the present, producing new photographs and audiovisual recordings of interviews with members of the Rocinha community. Thus, these new dimensions of memories about this territory were built. Like this. This is our field research. As I mentioned earlier, the project involves 7 distinct moments interconnected with each other, and both research and photographic collections, interviews with residents arose from a common desire to publish little-known historical material about Rocinha. In this project's first phase, the Sankofa and IMS teams spent approximately 6 months just meeting periodically in Rocinha and IMS headquarters, involved conversations, walks in the territory, and bibliography research. It was understood that historical photographs should be the project's initial foundation, but they were not enough. So interviews with residents were conducted. In the IMS collection, we identified about 60 photographs of the Rocinha favela and its surroundings, mostly panoramic views, reproduced between 1860 and 1950s. We selected 23 of these images for further investigation. The viewpoints of the historic photos were mapped through field research from the same vantage point, along with video interviews with 12 residents of Rocinha and surrounding areas. They discussed the change in the landscape, comparing old and new images, and sharing personal memories and stories. All 12 interviews were suggested by members of the group, especially Museu Sankofa and community journalist collective called Fala Roça. In addition to the interviews, the audiovisual recordings of the stories involved a video maker, an anthropologist, and an editor. The oral histories contributed for locating the memories that might be hiding behind those 19th century and early 20th century photographs. And so I return to the question, if so, to answer, if so, how? Is it possible to convey the reality of other people? How to tell a story what is not mine or ours? To answer this question, the group decided to use audio and video as a research tools and as a result of capturing ambient soundscapes and the voices of residents and visitors. Audiovisual was chosen as a method of visual research and as a product that expressed the coexistence of peripheral vulnerability and freshness and cultural potency of that community. To conclude, this is one of our interviews. To conclude, what did the alleys and street sound like? The noise of motorcycle, people, children playing, the sound of car driving by, music from houses, local business, and people greeting each other from a distance. The sensory experience was again understood when working with the sound elements in stage 4 of this project. Now I'll have a sound to illustrate this image, but I will finish my reading and then I will show the images and the sound, okay? At times, it was the ambient sound that need to be prioritized. Still, at the time of the interviews, technology helped us to isolate the ambient sound to dedicate the experience to the voices of the residents, thus guaranteeing the echo of the memories of social groups that we have related to this space for decades. Therefore, it offered ways to listen, write, and inscribe new memories in the official stories of the city. Now, here's one of the videos that we produce, and please, you are also welcome to visit our multimedia platform. I will share with you after that, okay? So let's try here through this other. This is like a image which illustrates, like, it was one of the poetic action that we made with people, residents in Rocinha, through these headphones. They would allow to listen to these memories from Rocinha. Let's.
Preciso que a senhora comece falando o nome e a idade.
Meu nome é Francisca. Sou Francisca Oliveira, mais conhecida como Chica da Rocinha.
Chica da Rocinha, quantos anos?
Chica da Rocinha. Foi quando eu fui convidada, eu ganhei um espaço na imprensa, na mídia, né? Para poder levar a cultura e a necessidade da Rocinha. E aí começaram a me chamar de Chica da Rocinha, aí pegou, né? É a minha avó que me chamava de Chica da Rocinha, lá no Nordeste da Paraíba.
A senhora vem da Paraíba?
É, eu sou nordestina, eu cheguei...
Pai paraibano também.
É?
Veio com um pezinho.
Eu vim para Rocinha aos 20 anos de idade, já casada com 2 filhos. A seca nos obrigou, né? A necessidade nos teve que deixar nossas origens por causa disso, né? Eu cheguei aqui em 68, já com 2 filhos, já casada com 2 filhos, tive mais um aqui. E aí, logo em seguida, pouco tempo depois que eu cheguei, eu engajei na luta comunitária. E aí, veio aí até hoje, né?
E hoje a senhora trabalha?
Até eu continuo participando das coisas, de toda a luta por bem da Rocinha. A gente, eu fui da Associação de Moradores, fui agente comunitário de saúde, fundei escola, muita
Acho que é a luta, então, que lembra a Rocinha pra senhora, né?
Tudo lembra. Eu cheguei aqui na Rocinha, não é São Conrado, indo pra rua, era riacho, era mato, entendeu? Então, quer dizer, ver isso aqui é muito pequeno, muito poucas casas vendo hoje. Quer dizer, eu trabalhei como agente de saúde aqui quando...
Preciso que a senhora comece falando o nome e a idade.
Meu nome é Francisca.
Okay, just a sound experience. And to finish, I would like to show one of the videos. It's just 3 minutes. Let me show you here. The
A
internet.
primeira coisa que a gente pensa quando vê a foto é de onde ela foi tirada, qual a altura da Rocinha seria hoje.
Quando eu cheguei aqui, tudo era capim.
Cadê minha casa? Minha casa era pra estar aqui, ó. Antigamente isso aqui não tinha nome. Hoje é, como é que é o nome dessa rua aí da praia?
Esta aqui que você
Lizzie,
observa a minha casa agora, parece que eu tô lá em casa.
Aqui não tinha nada, que era só mato. Esse lado aí que você vê esse monte de pedra, de prédios, era uma lagoa. Então o bairro de São Conrado era aqui. Ele é aqui. Tá faltando muito prédio.
Cada vez que eu venho da praia para cá, eu vejo uma transformação que aconteceu em todo o espaço, seja no São Conrado, seja na Rocinha.
A que chama mais atenção é a minha área, é essa área toda verde aqui, a mata fechada. Isso me chama muita atenção, que a gente gostaria que hoje continuasse assim. Isso aqui é Vila Verde, a nossa preocupação, tá vendo? Isso é a preocupação da gente. Tá vindo para cá e tá chegando aqui nesse condomínio.
E me assusta, né? Me assusta porque isso aqui é um gerador muito grande, de um volume monstruoso de lixo, e lixo é grandemente responsável pela desorganização.
Aqui que eu achei interessante, porque era onde a lagoa entrava, a água do mar entrava e formava a lagoa aqui, ó. Era aqui, onde a gente está.
Ali na Via Ápia, se você furar aquele chão, aquilo ali é um rio que está ali debaixo.
Aqui é um canal.
Um canal imenso. Tinha água potável que passava por aquele valão.
Em vez de noite dormir, ia pegar água. De noite, porque se de manhã não tinha água na bica. Para conseguir água ali na Rua 1, na bica, tinha que ser de madrugada. Chegasse 5 da manhã, não tinha mais. Quando eu perdi o horário que eu dormia, aí eu tinha que pegar no laburiô, que era só mato. Agora é só casa.
Quando eu vim morar aqui, já tinha essa pista que tem hoje, já tinha. Só que a dificuldade é que naquele tempo não tinha o movimento que tem hoje. E hoje o movimento cresceu demais. Você vê que a dificuldade para a gente andar aqui com esse trânsito é fora de sério, né?
Lá atrás, em algum momento você conseguia identificar as ruas, porque as luzes das casas, elas eram de uma qualidade ruim. Então você olhava aquelas luzes mais brilhosas assim, você falava, caramba, ali é a Estrada da Gávea. E aí você ia acompanhando. Hoje você não consegue mais isso, porque todas as lâmpadas têm uma intensidade quase que igual.
Aquele tempo aqui, quando eu cheguei, era só praia, né? Então, não tinha os hotel nacional, esses prédios todos. A própria parte, essa parte da Rocinha, aqui tinha barraco de madeira, aqui era... Não tinha nada, era só... Mudou muito, né?
O que me chama mais atenção é realmente o crescimento da Rocinha, né? Na vertente Gávea, na Senhora da Conceição, que você não observa mais, né? A construção, né? O boom imobiliário para o bairro da Gávea e Leblon. E logicamente, o jockey, né? Toda essa arborização aqui ó, em torno do jockey, que aqui você via que ele fazia parte de toda a paisagem. Aqui não. Aqui eu vejo ele segregado.
Talvez, se você olhar lá no fundo, aquela cidade informal que está lá no fundo, foi a cidade que construiu tudo que está aqui na frente. Chega a ser simbólico, porque a gente está sempre lá atrás.
Eu nunca pensei de família minha ter condições de morar num prédio daqueles, né? E eu tenho um filho que mora num desse prédio aqui.
Antigamente, a Via Ápia era considerada a Copacabana, né? Todo mundo queria morar na Via Ápia. De uns anos para cá, a Via Ápia se tornou totalmente comercial.
Por morar aqui na Rocinha, né, e conhecer bem, ver que o fluxo de turista aqui é bastante. Não sabia que era tanto, de 2 anos para cá já sabia que já havia, mas não tanto. Pensei em abrir uma loja. Eu elaborei fotos diferentes. Turista caminhando na Rocinha, o ângulo todo da favela.
Eu acho que eu vou terminar meu dia de vida mesmo aqui na Rocinha mesmo.
Ei.
And last but not least, I would love to introduce now Marcos Balter, who is the Fritz Rainer Professor of Musical Composition at Columbia University. And I wouldn't even know how to describe the works that you do. I think ethereal, otherworldly, just really magnificent. And just to give a short sampling of his illustrious awards and titles, he's the recipient of the American Academy of Arts and Letters Music Award, the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation Fellowship, and numerous other distinctions. His pieces have been performed at the New York Philharmonic, the Los Angeles Philharmonic, and contemporary music ensembles around the world. And he's so humble, he said, just tell them my name is Marcos. And so here we go.
Because they know me anyway.
Bom dia.
Bom dia.
Boa tarde, né? Vamos ver. Check if the sound is. There. Oh, it's not side by side. It's messing with my spatial. Just use this one. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. Yes? Great. So I would like to start by thanking the organization.
It's better with the mic.
Is it
Marcos,
better?
Yeah, for us, the sound is more full.
Let's do the TV station thing. I won't move much, I promise. So I'd like to start by thanking the organization of the conference for this invitation. And it's really been truly wonderful to getting to know so many brilliant colleagues. And the talks have been really inspiring me and making me think a lot about many things that have been important to me. And I want to start with a disclaimer, which is already kind of given by Ana. I am not a musicologist, I'm not a historian, I'm not a theorist, I am a composer. So the focus of my talk is really about my own personal search for a way of existing as authentically as possible as a queer, Black, Brazilian composer living in the United States, whatever that means. My initial attraction towards concert music had much more to do with modes of creation, collaboration, and cooperation than with a desire to engage with a specific music genre. In fact, As I progressed in my formal musical studies in composition, both in Brazil and in the United States, I struggled with the notion that existing as a classical composer not only means accepting Eurocentric assumptions of what constitutes concert music, therefore accepting its technical frame as a point of departure and as a regulator, but also that it came with sonic expectations that are, at their core, racialized. In a very recent interview, just a week ago, published by the webzine Post-Genre, George Lewis, my brilliant colleague at Columbia University and arguably one of the most influential scholars on Afro-diasporic concert music, was asked if he saw musical genre itself as a result of colonization of sound. And his answer was the following. In music, genre kinship and race often co-present in ways that cry out for decolonization. I borrow from Sarah Ahmed in seeing genre as a technology of kinship. In the contemporary visual arts, scholarship and criticism most often focuses on practices and historical periods rather than genres. For example, landscape painting is a genre, but painting is a practice. In music, genres also often function as institutionalizations of kinship-like discourses. As these become naturalized by institutions, fields, and critical discourses, the racial metonymics also become embedded. While one often hears that genre-based explanatories bring people together or render a work more transparent and intelligible, I find that excessive reliance on genre-based framings risks leaving us both blind and deaf to other more salient modes of meaning, end quote. Yesterday's brilliant talk by Professor Pedro Aragão pointed towards some of the real obstacles involved in the perception of race in music through institutionalized lenses, especially if one becomes blind to how misconstrued histories can be misleadingly documented. And when it comes to the documentation of Afro-diasporic music in Brazil and how it's being infused in what we call classical music, the reliance on stereotypically reconstructed sonic expectations and overly engagement with genre distracts us from looking at history itself and historical Black Brazilian music practices as more productive ways of speculating about what a decolonized Black Brazilian contemporary concert music may sound like. My own search for decolonized ways of existing as a Black Brazilian concert music composer started by looking at my own family history, which is quite unique. I'm incredibly lucky to be the great-great-great-grandson of Lucrécia Canaia Galvão, who was allegedly born in São Paulo in 1813 and died March 2nd, 1939 at the tender age of 126 years. Wow. Now, of course, that this is debatable because, registering of, Brazilian slaves and the exact date of birth, kind of changes. But if true, that makes her the oldest surviving Brazilian slave. She was the daughter of Miguel Galvão and Margarida Zambuja, whose last names come from their owners, as it was customary among slaves. She was born a slave at Denisa Zambuja's home, the honor of her mother, and spent her young years as the nanny of Azambuja's son. Later on, when the Azambuja boy left home to go to school, Lucrécia was sold to Joaquim and Francisca Cananea, hence her name, who intended to eventually gift her to their only daughter, Laura Cananea, and her husband, Major Joaquim Antonio Dias. Francisca Cananea was extremely abused, physically abusive towards Lucrécia, who then decided to run away for her own safety. She was chased as a fugitive slave, but found refuge in the house of Joaquim Floriano Toledo, a councilman, who convinced the Cananea family to spare her. She stayed at the councilman's for only a few days, subsequently working as a servant for different families. It is unclear if her marriage to Joaquim Cananea, also a slave, and probably also a property of the Cananea family, occurred before or after she ran away from the Cananea household. But Joaquim and Lucrécia had several children, who she eventually outlived all of them, with the exception of Margarida Cananea Galvão, my great-great-grandmother. In this picture, you can see not only Lucrécia and Margarida, but also Margarida's daughter, Maria Benedita Cananeia da Silva. So that is Lucrécia in the middle, of course. That is her daughter, and that is her granddaughter, my great-grandmother. And behind my great-grandmother are her daughters, my great-aunts. Thanks to my family longevity genes, I was fortunate to spend quite a lot of time with all of them in my youth. My last surviving great aunt, who is also in that picture, Tianeia, died just 2 months ago at the tender age of 104. Wow. So I have a long ways to go. No Russian building a big Cadillac. It is thanks to the public curiosity towards Lucrécia's longevity that I have all this information fully documented by newspaper articles between 1931 and 1939, with extensive quotes by Lucrécia herself about her life in 19th century Brazil. And I realize how extremely lucky I am to be a Black person in Brazil with that access to my genealogy. It is quite rare. In them, Lucrécia talked at length of her involvement with the Irmandade de Nossa Senhora do Rosário dos Homens Pretos, an all-Black Catholic organization founded in 1711 and still active nowadays, especially in Salvador, Bahia. In Lucrécia's obituary, also published in a local newspaper, much attention is paid to her leadership role within that religious organization. She held the title of Irmã de Mesa Perpétua, something like emeritus chairship, for 90 years, and was one of the most active and revered members of the organization. These religious organizations were created for Brazilian slaves by Jesuit priests with the goal of promoting religious conversions. But in reality, such organizations allowed Brazilian slaves to preserve African religious practices otherwise banned in the country within the protected walls. A certain degree of syncretism was permitted by the priests. For instance, the music in religious services in these Black organizations often featured drums rather than customary European instruments, which is still something that you can witness in Salvador at the Irmandade over there. But even more interesting is how these officially permissible mixtures allow the slaves to hide the practice of African religious rituals by creating artificial analogies between African European deities and concepts. The development and, more importantly, the survival of Candomblé and other religious beliefs that are closely related are directly linked to these all-Black Catholic organizations and their reverberations. Candomblé is both intrinsically Brazilian and Afro-diasporic. More relevant even than the syncretism between African and European religions is the syncretism of different religious practices from Central and Western African nations that have operated the transatlantic slave trade for 4 centuries. While Candomblé terreiros, or temples, are often divided into different nações, nations, as to emphasize the prominence of certain African ethnic groups in their language and beliefs, these divisions became much more tenuous over time, especially in areas such as Rio de Janeiro, my hometown, which succeeded Salvador in 1763 as Brazil's capital, which resulted in a higher influx of African slaves from several parts of the country, those originating not only new Candomblé temples around the city, but also Umbanda, a descendant of Candomblé, if you will, which is a much more syncretized version of Candomblé. The main deities of Candomblé and Umbanda, the Orixás, were themselves united through syncretism, as many of them were originally worshipped by different African nations. They didn't exist side by side as a group, if you will. To make matters even more fluid, Candomblé and Umbanda terreiros are not centrally controlled. They are autonomous. There's not a religious chief, there is not a head of Candomblé among all terreiros, and there is not a unifying religious text. Knowledge is primarily transmitted orally and within fragmented communities. And while a sense of kinship between terreiros and their practices can be felt, the preoccupation with a global authenticity is not germane to their existence. Yet, given the importance of music and dance in Candomblé and Umbanda rituals, as well as the Catholic rituals in officially sponsored all-Black Brazilian organizations, such as Lucrécia's Irmandade de Nossa Senhora do Rosário dos Homens Pretos, therein lies my musical heritage as a Black Brazilian composer. Not in a sound or in the search for its purest form, which doesn't exist given that it was never singular, but in its history and practices through times, as George Lewis wisely signaled. What becomes interesting to notice then is that this search for historical clarity and authenticity in Black Brazilian music is in itself Eurocentric, and a Eurocentric way of looking at it, in spite of the fact that Black Brazilian music, polymorphous and ever-expanding nature, is primarily rooted in caused by colonial practices. As a contemporary Black Brazilian composer of concert music, I have then claimed freedom from sonic expectations of Blackness, shifting my attention from sound to strategies of resistance to transformation of my ancestors' past into a viable present for myself. I realize that I am talking a lot here and I'm not playing music, so I want to play a little excerpt. It's just a 7-minute excerpt of a 30-minute documentary of my collaboration with choreographers Beauty Jones and Diane McIntyre. Let's see if sound works. Crossing fingers. And it does not. It's too good to be true, right? We tried, did it all right.
Yeah.
When I met Marcos, he was introduced to me as Brazilian. And at that time, I was thinking a lot about what the people who work in the contemporary avant-garde progressive art world, most people are not people of color. I was trying to find a way to get basic with him. Let's talk as two people who are not white people. Let's talk about where are you from?
We talked a lot about where we came from, who we were, and how our stories were
I was
confusing.
confused about whether my home was really the Cleveland environment or the New York City environment.
When we had our initial conversations, they were not that different. When I talked to Bill and when I talked to Diane, and when we decided that we were going to frame the piece around the concept of home.
And for him, that home had many different layers.
It was really interesting how these three very different experiences of these three Black artists with completely different histories, even understanding of what being Black is.
This piece is a journey, and through the journey, we fly.
Sort of came together quite beautifully.
I heard someone singing. I said, "Whoa, that is very haunting. It's really beautiful." I said, "I wonder what that's from." And then when I came into the studio, Marcos told me that that is the chant.
It's a chant for Oxalá, who is one of the main deities of Candomblé. The whole piece is based on this chant, this Yoruba chant in Yoruba itself that talks about, a father or my father, which can be seen as a literal father or, some higher being, either coming into one's home or you going towards, your father's home. So I wanted to create this sense of ascension, this gradual ascension, this long trance. And when I saw Diane dancing, and when I saw her dressed in white, and the gestures that she was doing, around the musicians, she looked like she was, sort of receiving that spirit. And, and the dance itself really looked like what you would see in an Umbanda or Candomblé ritual. So the title of the piece is We Carry Our Homes Within Us, Which Enables Us to Fly, which is a quote by John Cage. The first time I heard that quote, it so connected with me. I was like, yes, someone is actually talking about home or where one comes from or where one belongs in a way that I can understand, because I'm looking at my own trajectory of, jumping from one place to another and, being away from my home country for most of my life and trying to understand what is home and where is home and, and then coming to that final realization that I am home. When I saw Bill's work for the first time, I was very surprised, but I could understand why Bill saw the piece the way that he did. In my case, it was very much connected to my ancestors in Brazil, the idea of slavery, as being sort of a confinement that can be seen as home or a forced home, and the idea of not belonging to where you are, which I also sort of connected to my own story. And then when I saw Bill sort of recontextualizing that and really talking very overtly about African American struggles in the U.S., especially like issues surrounding police violence and unjust incarceration, I understood it. It was still about oppression. It was still about persecution of minorities. It was still about feeling constrained.
Art, music, is going to be one of the ways we fight back the darkness of this moment.
This is my fifth prayer today.
So maybe all you have to do is do more, enable us to fly.
Going down, Captain.
Maybe you just have to play heartbreakingly beautiful and fierce and intelligent. All right, one music, throw down. Working with you on that music gave me an opportunity to think about my body, to think about what it means for me to be on stage, performing again with Bad D, with white hair. And it encouraged me to be generous and fierce. Generous, fierce, brave.
YouTube.
Working with Bill and Diane was beautiful, and
God.
it really made
Oh
me,
my God.
yeah. I know. I actually watched it. I feel emotional all over again. It made me understand that it is possible to work with Afro-diasporic artists, even from different countries, and still feel that sense of kinship, even though our stories are different, yet so similar. For the past 20 years, I have composed several works inspired by different orishas, such as this one. And while this collaboration I did use an archival recording of a ponto, a chant, as a sung in a Brazilian terreiro, a lot of my Candomblé-inspired music work does not employ music rotation, but rather focuses much more on more abstract and sometimes not necessarily sonic elements. Pan, a recent collaboration with flutist Claire Chase at Harvard University, electronic musician Levin Lorenzo from New School, director Doug Fitch, musicologist Jennifer Judge, poet Laura Mullen, and Jane Sachs, who is the CEO of social justice organization Project End, for instance, had us intensely researching extended instrumental techniques, improvisation strategies, and acoustic and electronic spatialization. As importantly, the work explored new ways of engaging diverse communities in the act of performing by combining elements of oral tradition and hybrid notation or improvisational strategies geared towards participants with little or no musical background. In here, the idea of initiation of a community member played a central role in the work. Pan examined gender inequity, consent, and abuse of power through inclusive and non-traditional learning techniques. As importantly, the work explored new ways of engaging diverse communities, several at once sometimes, in the act of performing by combining elements of, Its workshops and performances have included members of persecuted refugee groups, senior-centered residents, individuals of diverse mental and physical abilities, and children from underserved communities in traditional and non-traditional venues worldwide. Much of the conceptual frame of the work emerged from our partnership with the Riceboro Youth Center and Senior Center in Brooklyn, New York, with which we conducted several meetings during a period of 4 months, as documented by an extensive New York Times article from 2018. The philosophical approach to these meetings sought to incorporate strategies from Brazilian theater director Augusto Boal's Theater of the Oppressed and Brazilian theorist Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy methodology as presented in his seminal work, Pedagogy of the Oppressed. In our initial meetings, participants were introduced to the overall story of the rise and fall of the demigod Pan as reimagined by Claire, Doug, and myself. They were then invited to share their own personal experiences and assessments of different moral dilemmas as presented in our story in a variety of ways, from verbal recounting to community building activities, including interactive games and open structured social events. The initial narrative then gave way to a story that felt representative to all participants, both dramaturgically and physically. Once all members of our collective heightened their agency within our storytelling approach, we embarked on sonic and choreographic exercises in which we explored instrumental building, performance techniques, and visual representations of performance instructions that would allow us not only to build our musical language, but also to create a path towards inclusive virtuosity. We intentionally created an instrumentation that provided sustainability and easy economic access, repurposing everyday objects such as plastic bottles, metal pipes, and kitchen utensils such as glasses and pans, by exploring the full spectrum of their expressive possibilities. Much of Levin Lorenzo's work as our electronic music engineer involved the creation and manipulating of sounds of our jam sessions, which posteriorly allowed us to build pre-recorded materials that enable the work to be performed by smaller forces without compromising the desirable magnitude of our sound world. Due to this, we have been able to present Pan in versions that involve small communities in rural settings, as well as in much larger contexts, such as our performances in the St. Paul Orchestra or the San Francisco Symphony or the Paris Symphony Orchestra. Each preparation and performance of the work also enabled us to expand and diversify our leadership structure. Former participants are often invited back to subsequent performances as in a new capacity, including workshop coaching and group moderation. For our performance with students from the Chicago Public School System at the Garfield Park Conservatory, the performances were primarily supervised by individuals involved in previous installments in New York, Boston, and Minneapolis. Pan is at its core a ritual. Even the score looks like a ritual, and everything involves around the idea of where one is and what is one's role in a specific place and time. Its success depends on it ever evolving, being changed by whoever inhabits it in ways that enable past and present individuality and collectivity to coexist in truly hybrid ways. That hybridity does not have a sound, but a multitude of sonic possibilities that are in constant conversation with one another and with the histories of whoever inhabits them. That's how I exist as a composer. Thank you for listening.
all the panelists to come up and then we can take some questions. Thank you for those three incredibly rich talks. There's so much to talk about and we don't really have too much time, but we will take some questions. I just really want to emphasize some things that were said. Marcus just mentioned the strategies of transformation, practices of walking through space, movement, activities, and it reminds me a lot of the work of Milton Santos, the geographer, Black Brazilian geographer, who was the first Tinker chair at Columbia, by the way. And he also wrote about, thinking of geography as a place of moving through, of activities, these activities that create social life, that create the city, that create the law, that challenge the law. And so in these presentations, you really see a push towards new kinds of vocabularies, new kinds of ways of listening, of moving through visual and sonic architectures to really account for the kinds of life making that have been happening and just if you kind of stick inside a mode of thinking that's based on categories or taxonomy or division of the cidade partida, you just miss entire histories of the unplanned city, the histories of ancestrality that have been passed through generations in face of torture, in face of murder, and all of these incredible stories that are in the archive and in the repertoire, right? It's not just one or the other, but the ways that histories exist in material objects, in the rituals and the movement of with things too, and how that gets transmitted as well. And so there's just so much to talk about. I just want to open it up and let the conversation happen. If actually, maybe if you want to speak to each other, because there's so much resonance in the talks also.
I guess I'd be curious to hear what you say first, but
yes. Lisa. Okay.
Oh, I don't need that. Well, maybe just picking up, thank you so much for a wonderful session. Just picking up maybe on the comments, the invocation of the archive and the repertoire. Because I was thinking about the question of temporality that came up yesterday as well, and something really distinctive about sound is its temporality. And we heard about that in relation to the AI, the project of recording it, and that wonderful AI project. But of course, the issue of temporality, I mean, it's just so, what an amazing story, right? About your great, I kind of lost track of how many great but that incredible longevity. And 90 years as the Irmã Perpetua is a good title for that, right? In the Irmandad. And so how much ritual, right, which belongs to the, using that dichotomy, the association tends to be that the archive is more permanent, right? More permanent records, and that the repertoire is ephemeral, right? And it's just such a beautiful illustration of how, in fact, the archive can be very ephemeral as well. And the repertoire has a kind of longevity that you are continuing into your own work and your own practice. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that point of, I guess my question could be, because it was so suggestive at the end, talking about this work, pan as a ritual. I was kind of curious to hear more about what the ritual significance for the different participants would be. So that could be a question, or if you want to reflect on this idea, or anyone, on ephemerality versus perpetuity, I guess I could put it.
Thank you for this question, beautiful question. I mean, for a while I was obsessed with Jen Assman's writing on cultural memory, and what that actually means, and the power of witnessing, the power of actually having a true witness, someone who was in that space, rather than the memorialization, of memorializing of, an event, and how that is a completely different way of engaging with history or stories, So yes, I am extremely lucky that I was able to access that through that. Of course, that's not something that it is attainable, at a larger scale. And that's why I don't try, not even do I intend to make my story as representative of every single Black Brazilian person, in the world, existing as a composer or not. But one thing that I do think that is interesting about this idea of how things are memorialized, how history gets to be preserved, or sometimes not preserved, and sometimes intentionally not preserved, is exactly that sometimes the desire towards the crystallization of an identity, especially if it is an identity that is intrinsically a multitude of identities, and it's something that is a forced identity or was created forcefully, is not only dangerous, but sometimes detrimental to the advancement of not only artistic expression of people within that group, but also with the limitation of what that voice may generate or has had generated before.
Yeah, maybe to draw on that, and a question or a comment for all of you, Urmila had brought up this term atmosphere, and that she's increasingly thinking about a surround or a kind of atmosphere. And I'm kind of interested in this spectrum from experiment to noise, because it seems like, we kind of went through the gamut of that. So Ana-Luiza brings up the question of sort of noise, the street corner, really kind of itinerant, unexpected sound, and the voice has to find a kind of legibility in the midst of that sound. So all of the people who are being interviewed and so on, it's their environment, it's their atmosphere. And then everything from that to, I think, picking up on Lisa's question, sort of experiment and ritual. So this radical kind of experiment, and you're thinking, Bill T. Jones, and people for whom sort of training the body and embodiment, but also doing that in the mode of experimental dance, experimental music, becomes the way that you're also entering into this, creating this new ritual, I think, as Lisa was asking. So what's this? I mean, if we think about surround and atmosphere as the way to maybe think about the temporality of sound or a new vocabulary, as Anna was saying, what's the spectrum from noise to experiment? Like, is music in that, is something happening in that spectrum?
I mean, to me,
and yeah, I mean, I have a question for you too, yeah.
Very rudimentarily answering, this very complex question. I mean, I do think that existing with sort of ritualistic ways of thinking of music making is, intrinsically experimental. And that's when people ask me if I consider myself an experimental composer, I say yes, and then usually the discourse goes straight into genre. How the music sounds, right? Like it's like the sound of the music should actually be an indicator of how experimental it is or it isn't. And then the discussion really starts to shift towards, the history of it, the context, the extra musical or even non-musical context in which this is built, and sometimes even with the idea of invention of rituals. Right? Like not necessarily like a traditional continuation of a ritualized way of looking at music making, but the invention of rituals and the reimagining of histories, especially the histories that we don't have access to, as means of experimentation. And everything is valid in there. Everything is actually potentially a ritualized or a ritualizable sound, right? I have a hard time actually with dealing with the word noise because of the ways in which I look at music making. I think that noise is a choice sometimes, though I do understand that it has a very relevant usage, within certain circles. But for me, as a creator, I don't necessarily look at unexplored sound sources as noise, but as just that, unexplored or unritualized and uncodified sonic entities.
Oh,
nice.
Yeah, I can compliment about this art sound experience. Like, because I remember when I was writing the text, I was remember an photography class that I realized that I developed in the Amazon region like 1 decade ago. We were teaching photography and climate change. And so we invited people to do a silent walk through in different places, in a part of like an agroforest close to Amazonia border and a monoculture, like a plantation. And then to understand the image, we first understand the chaos of the multi-sounds in the middle of the forest and then the absence of the chaos, like the silence. And is it correct, Claudio? How can we think about climate change without sound, without multiplicity sounds?
Yeah.
And then we started thinking about photography through the sound. For me, work in photography, I have to think about the sound as well, because I'm not working alone. I work with people. So this project, to understand the idea of what kind of project that we can develop together, we have to be in silent to listen to other people. So the idea of noise could be understand as an art sound experience. When we stay there, just using our like an active listening all the time. Because you can put as a researcher in a perspective with other people that are surrounding you and expecting that we can develop something together. For me, the sound of favela, that's okay, but a motor taxi, could be noisy, but it could be useful to understand why this is happening here. Like what's this kind of sounds can tell you about something, and so on and so forth.
Yes. Thank you. James? Oh, and then Kevin. Oh, no, they don't need.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, thank you again. And so I'm wondering, Marcos, you said that you felt this sense of kinship, even though you did have obviously come from different diasporic backgrounds. But I'm also curious about the moments where you felt maybe friction, or in the workshops as well, if you felt moments of friction in the sort of generative moments from that, because as we remember from Kevin's talk yesterday, sometimes those acts of listening across difference is the project that might be the most generative, or those moments might be the most generative. And also thinking about Sergio's presentation as well, in terms of the geopolitical, like moving from the artistic to the geopolitical, and those moments of listening across difference, I think, are the most where you actually find the most like the meat of those encounters. So I'm curious, just for all of you, what were those moments, and how have you been thinking about those?
I mean, it's funny because the project that was most challenging in terms of negotiating all those things was PAN, not which enables us to fly. And actually, out of all of my collaborative projects, the easiest perhaps was which enabled us to fly, which not coincidentally, the entire leadership of the project was Black. So I did feel that sense of kinship, of understanding what is the role of a Black artist and how to look at it, like post-diasporically, or truly pan-diasporically, just came very easily. It's much harder for me actually when it goes beyond race, it goes beyond ethnicity, and it actually involves like a pan-ethnic, way of approaching things. There, I think the negotiations are a little bit tricky. And also like in the Bill and Diane and I partnership, was also where I felt the difference between being South American, North American, as not being as hierarchized as it tends to be. You know, me as the guest, the poor guest, the poor cousin, as we say in Brazil. I didn't feel that. I didn't feel that quite as prominently, not from them, sometimes from the institutions involved, yes, but not from them necessarily. So it was really interesting to see that, like, actually I feel a sense of greater freedom artistically and individually when I work with other Black individuals and what I'm trying to achieve.
Sure. Yeah, I really love this indication of listening. And to me, what immediately comes to mind is the work conditions in these embassies, because embassies really are points of communication. They're spaces in which a lot of information is passing through and it's going in different directions. And in Brazil, in the Brazilian embassy in New Delhi, one of the pain points was the fact that messages had to be encrypted, so they would regularly receive diplomatic cables that had to be encrypted because some of it was supposedly sensitive correspondence between Brazil and Portugal, and India was hostile to Portugal at the time, for good reason. And so this very small staff had to put a lot of work encrypting and decrypting all of these cables, and that made listening very hard. And so it gave them a certain amount of agency in South Asia to make their own decisions and make calls on behalf of Brazil that weren't necessarily what Rio de Janeiro would have wanted. The other thing that comes to mind is the sort of presence of economics as a lingua franca, but it's not a universal or a homogeneous lingua franca. So there's different dialects, and turning back to Sachs, Ignacy Sachs, I'm struck by how much of a chameleon he was. He really was able to move between the Marxist lingo and the structuralist lingo, the import substitution lingo, quite fluently. And that was something that many people of his generation could do, but it's also something that I think sets them apart from the present day of economics, which is I think kind of allergic to different dialects.
Kevin?
All right, I'm going to try to think of a question by the end of my comment, but it's kind of a comment, really. And what I heard actually coming through, and I'd like to maybe hear more from each of you about, is this idea of home that comes through in all the, that gets threaded through, right? Sérgio talks about traveling diplomats and economists who try to recreate a version of home, or right, the sense of home plus the place they're at now, especially for the architecture and sort of furnishings of the embassy. Louisa's project, where people are recognizing home as a place of change. It's not static, right? It's changed over time. And then Marcos's, which really resonates with my own sense of myself too, of I am the home, right? Because there is no home out there. But what I was struck by in that was in the I Can Fly piece was drawing from John Cage, right? To talk about Black dispossession and Blacks, right? And so that was an interesting kind of person to draw that inspiration from. So I was just kind of wondering how the home, again, I don't have the question, but it's just a thread that I saw going through of the sense of home and how it's very different in each of those, but kind of similar in the sense of this recognition that it's not particularized to a place, or that place can be changing, right? So anyway, it's like I said, just a comment more, but if anyone has anything more to say about that.
I mean, in direct relation to, in direct relation to stealing from Cage, that's exactly what I did. I mean, I'm fully aware of the problematics of Cage's aesthetic and the Cage as an individual. I have extensively read about like Cage and Julius Eastman and other Black composers, and the very fragile relationship between him and other Black artists, or the way in which he approached different cultures in a very sort of appropriative kind of way. So the way that I looked at it, I liked his quote and I appropriated it.
Well, we can conclude with that and go to lunch.